Welcome back to the panel discussion, Identity and Access Management, a top priority for states in 2019. Sponsored by HID Global on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. My guests today are Todd Kimbrell, Deputy Executive Director, Department of Information Resources and CIO for the state of Texas. Rajiv Rao, Chief Technology Officer, Office of Information Technology Services, State of New York. Doug Robinson, Executive Director of NASIO, and Jerry Cox, Director of Business Development at HID Global. I'm your moderator, John Thomas Flynn. When we closed the last segment, we were talking about citizen access and IAM. And one of the things, Doug, you mentioned at the end of that last segment you wanted to weigh in on.
I did, John. I wanted to make the connection with the CIO priorities because I think there's some alignment that we could talk about in terms of we're into the citizen access and really around digital government. But if you look at our 2019 CIO priorities, number 1, security and risk management. Number 4, digital government. Number 8, data management. Number 10, identity and access management. You can connect the dots between all of those, and I think that's certainly what the state CIOs and what they want to do in their organizations is they have aspirations to deliver those services to citizens. The challenge is that it's got to be accompanied by the recognition that we need some business process improvement and business rationalization behind the scenes. We've got legacy systems. So that's one of the challenges is the experience and the relationship with citizens in their states is pretty sporadic and really kind of transitional. It doesn't happen on a regular basis. It's not the same as their consumer. So it might be a year between those experiences and interactions and renewing their professional license, getting their fishing license, renewing their DMV, 4 years when they're doing their driver's license. So it becomes more of a user experience that's problematic in terms of help desk and support, and you also have to be able to connect all those back-end systems and modernize those along the way while you're doing that. So I just wanted to point that out, that the technology is just one small component of being able to deliver these kind of seamless customer experiences to citizens as states try to roll this out.
And Rajiv, you were mentioning about the state and local, the multi-government issues that confront us with identity management, because citizens don't just get their services from the state.
Absolutely, yes. So the citizen is a citizen, regardless of what service he's availing, whether it's from state agencies or from local government. So the question I keep bringing up and in internal conversations is around the identity. Why do we have to have X number of identity stores? And why does a citizen have to have accounts created in all of these identity stores and then have to remember those passwords if they're not the same in all these identity stores? And especially if he's going to be renewing or availing of a service once a year, his first action is going to be forgot password, and you're going to go reset that, right? That tends to be what happens, right? And that not only is a poor experience for him, it also is an overhead to the IT folks that support that system, because that costs money. Resetting a password is not it does take compute and cycles to do that. So that's not efficient. If you have a single place where you consume identity from, or you offer it as a service, then there's no reason why a local service or a local government or a municipality cannot consume identity as a service and then control the access to the application outside and decoupled from the identity service, which would just make it so much easier and much more secure, because now you reduce the footprint and the attack vectors are kind of minimized down to a much more robust service.
Are any of the states actually doing, I guess you'd call it an intergovernmental approach like you're describing? Is any state actually working with local governments to have a statewide approach to this kind of thing?
I've started the conversation, and there seems to be some traction for those entities that are struggling with providing support for those kind of services. They certainly are very interested in that shared service model where they could start to consume services like identity and a few others that we kind of like backup as a service and things like that they could probably avail off from the consolidation
that kind of cooperation wouldn't be totally unique, because a number of the states are out there providing data center services to states. In fact, Los Angeles County, I think, just went to the state for a number of their data center operations control. It's pretty interesting development. I see the same thing happening. Jerry, have you seen anything like that?
So I do see some I see some interesting stuff going on. So there are some federal requirements that have come down lately that actually affect citizens in terms of identity and credentialing. So the Cures Act requires that patients direct their own healthcare data. And if they want their healthcare record to be sent from one doctor to another doctor, that patient has to be identity proofed at identity assurance level 2. They have to be authenticated at authentication assurance level 2. So it's the same kind of stuff that we have seen for EPCS, that we've seen for CGIS. Now, patients, the population of the United States. So that the timing is very good for states to take on that kind of a central role and take care of that citizen proofing, credentialing, in a way that can be consumed by these different applications, these different needs. There's no reason that we should have 3 different hospitals providing 3 different identities, right? Absolutely. It's crazy, right? And then all of the doctors already have to get credentialed.
And John, we're going to see this already with Firstnet, the public safety broadband network. And so that's a nationwide, so that's another example of, again, a federal program, but it's really governed by the states and used at the local level. So we've got right now in the kind of first phase of deployment, close to 600,000 end users. They have a identity and credentialing and access management, an ICAM framework that is really more federated, because it has to be federated. They're going to be able to have to use credentials that have already been issued and identity proofed and vetted among a whole host of first responders, firefighter, police, EMS. They have to be able to use these devices long term as we roll out the Firstnet for those users. And again, I think you're going to have a lot of collisions if you don't allow those users to be able to get on the network and be authorized, the access control, as you talked about. You want to make sure that that firefighter that has that device is a legitimate firefighter in some type of credential. Makes it much more difficult. How do you do that? And so that's one thing they're addressing right now.
I just want to say something, John. And I'm hoping he doesn't have to go through a forgot password scenario when he's trying to get on Firstnet for an emergency service scenario, right? So it all goes back to, let's make it simple, let's make it consistent, so they don't have to struggle with this when it's not needed, right? That's not their priority, and if they're getting stuck on that.
Running into a hazmat incident, though, and you're fully gowned up and gloved up, how do you use biometrics? How do you use a retinal scan when you've got a full mask shield on, and oxygen? So it's a totally different environment of how they're going to use these secure devices to be able to have interoperable communications in the amount of an emergency. So these are realistic. These are not in the abstract. They're happening today. They've got to address that.
I was going to ask this question, but I think you folks have already answered it. I was wondering why the whole concept of identity access management had jumped into the top 10 like it did. Obviously, it's a huge problem, and the more we talk about it, the more complex and complicated it really gets, particularly when we go into these multi-layers of government trying to work together to make it easier for the citizens to do their business. We talked about mobility with the government workforce. Again, I mentioned mobility brings an extra layer of complexity to identity access for citizens, correct?
It does. It does. Certainly, we're seeing those challenges. Trying to satisfy the needs and requirements of every individual unique citizen is a daunting task at times. And I think the movement, why is it an issue now? Why is it a top priority now instead of 10 years ago? And if you look back at how government has delivered services, we were like the e-commerce phase that people saw in the commercial markets. Government had been in this e-government process wherein we were taking transactions and moving them online. And I think everybody pretty much across the country has now checked that box. We now have services available online. We're taking online payments. The risk associated with that is gone. And we're shifting into this world of digital government. And in order to really effectively move into digital government where we're automating everything and being able to take advantage of data and single data stores instead of multiple data stores, and to deliver services to the citizen, we have to be able to leverage that data. We have to be able to get more automated in areas that we couldn't before, and a key part of that is going to be the citizen identity. We have to have that in order to be able to tie the underlying data together to deliver services in a digital government environment.
I have another question that I think is always of interest, and it certainly is of interest to you folks and your colleagues in government, and that is, how do you pay for it? Is this one of those things that you can go before the Finance Committee or the legislature? Do you put a security spin on it? Do you put a breach spin on it? How do you get money for this kind of thing? So we always know that's the mother's milk of any kind of technology project.
Yeah, it is a security thing. No regards. Identity is your key to the kingdom. I mean, if I have your identity, I have everything I need to be able to access your data, especially with the way we implement access controls. So it is definitely a security play. I mean, there's no question about that. So we just made a significant investment on the security side of identity to improve the security posture of our identity services, provide additional assurance level functionality that we did not have at some time. We're going to have that operational shortly. So as the industry is maturing and you're starting to bring in additional platforms that are going to be leveraging services from the state, you need to provide these services. And yeah, so it's almost always a security play before it's anything else.
Okay. I'd like to go around the table here to talk a little bit about implementation, what you've been doing in your state and also what you see in the industry and around the country. And that is, okay, you do the project, what are some of the lessons learned? What's some of the advice you would give to your colleagues at NASCIO or at local government levels or at the federal government level for that matter in rolling these out? What'd you learn from the whole thing?
Well, I'll say for Texas, we are moving forward with this initiative to create this digital assistant wherein, we are now going to start capturing the citizen identities. For us, we haven't gone far enough down that path to really have a full suite of lessons learned, but one thing that has become obvious, because we're taking an opt-in approach, not only for the citizens, but also for our partner agencies and the services that they deliver online, we are seeking voluntary participation in deploying these services digitally, even though they're already on texas.gov today. But nonetheless, the agencies have to agree to participate in this new strategy and vision. And we're seeing that there is some reluctance on some part, some of the agencies maybe a little bit reluctant to try something new. And I think, what's true in Texas, at least as I've seen since I've been there, is nobody likes to be first, nobody likes to be last. So we work really hard to try and identify who that lead steer is and get that one steer moving in the right direction, and then the herd follows.
Anything you do differently?
No, I think I don't think so. I mean, I think largely we put together a very good technology stack. We have a great partner we're working with. I think we're going to hit our target of this fall with the first release, and I think it's all coming together very nicely for us.
Rajiv, what's your experience in New York?
So we quickly realized we needed to go to a hybrid model for those SaaS services, so we're not dependent on the data center or a single point of failure, which would basically take all those services offline. So what we're working on really diligently right now is to securely extend this service out into a cloud space as well. So those SaaS services are consuming it from there, from a cloud space first before they come down to a secondary data center, like on-prem for us. So those are the architectural changes we are starting to incorporate in that refresh cycle right now. Just to mitigate one risk that we see today is we have 2 data centers that run this service, but we have external services that are coming all the way back into our data center to consume that, and it kind of defeats the purpose of having a SaaS service to a degree. And we want to change that dynamic a little bit.
Okay.
You make that
Doug,
sound so simple.
Doug, you got 30 seconds. What are the lessons learned out there in the hemisphere?
You've got to address your legacy environment, and by that I mean not only the systems, but you may have a legacy of disparate identity and access management pieces out there. So you've got to figure out how you're going to address that. Is it interoperability at a standards level, or are you going to kind of rip and replace and say we're going to have an enterprise solution across all the agencies, kind of what New York is looking at and what they're deploying, which is 160,000 employees all are on the same identity as a service. I think aspirationally the state CIOs would love to say, I deliver identity as a service as I deliver X as a service. So it becomes the X as a service component. The challenge with that is number one, data quality. If you look at these data stores, you look at the identity of the data they have about citizens or about employees, across the board, it's not consistent. You'll line up 5 citizens, you're going to get 4 common, and then you're going to get 1 address difference. And so I think that's a big problem for them, is the complexity of their current environment.
Jerry Cox, bring us home. What's the industry looking at in terms of rolling out these systems and the best practices and lessons learned? You got 1 minute.
So a couple of key things. Really 2 different ends of the spectrum. For citizens, for officers, things have to be frictionless, and they have to work every time, right? You can't have an officer attempting to log in and put their fingerprint on a device, and it's not working, and the guy in front of you you pulled over, he's getting out of the car with a gun. That's not going to work, right? It's got to be quick. It's got to be frictionless. It has to work every time. Mm-hmm. Same thing with doctors, with EPCS. If they can't prescribe controlled drugs, and they're in a pain practice, that's a problem, especially if they're in the state of New York where it's mandated by law that they have to do it that way. This stuff has to work. At the other end of the spectrum, PsyCam, which is where we started, to come full circle, that was a decade ago, right? It needs to be refreshed. It was ahead of its time, but it does give you the interoperability that's needed between states for things like first responders, right? So that PsyCam stuff that was based on FICAM, that's still applicable. Not going to work for citizens, but for first responders, absolutely.
Yeah, and Doug mentioned they're taking a look at that, so that's something we can talk about next time. With that, we'll have to close. I'd like to thank our guest today, Todd Kimbrell, Deputy Executive Director, Department of Information Resources and CIO for the state of Texas, Rajiv Rao, Chief Technology Officer, Office of Information Technology Services, State of New York, Doug Robinson, Executive Director of NASCIO, and Jerry Cox, Director of Business Development at HID Global. I'm your moderator, John Thomas Flynn, and you're listening to Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search for HID Global.